Hello YouTube. I just completed Royal Champion and I'm going to be sharing some games and going over what it is you guys can do to get to Ultimate Champion. So just before I share my first tip on how to get to Ultimate Champion, I just want to preface this by saying that I'm not going to be sharing tips with, or about how to choose your deck or anything along those lines. I'll leave that up to you guys. There are plenty of videos and resources online for finding the best deck in the meta or the best deck with a card that you like. I'll also share a trick at the end of the video that I use also that helps me quite a lot when getting to Ultimate Champion. But the first tip that I want to give when it comes to pushing up ladder and getting to Ultimate Champion is not overcommitting. Now, what that means essentially is obviously just not spending too much elixir on offense, but the games can end in 3 minutes. But if you ever notice and you watch pro players, the games almost always tend to go to 5 minutes, right? And the reason is A, they're playing at a much higher level than you and I, but also because they play a lot more passive and they play this back and forth game of figuring out first what the opponent is playing, right? That's the first thing you should do in any game of Clash Royale, is you're playing cards slowly and cycling them in the back and just waiting it out. You can maybe play a Miner or a Hog Rider at the bridge at the start if you're playing a cycle deck, but for the most part your goal right at the start of the game is to try and figure out what deck your opponent is playing. And if you go too aggressive, you can get punished really quickly. Right, I do this sometimes on my streams. I just, as a joke, will go Ice Column Hog Fireball first play, just to illustrate, usually that I'm tilted, but also, it's really not a good play, right? And I would never do that consistently, because that's overcommitting, right? I'm spending 6 elixir on offense, and, actually, well, in that instance, I'm spending 10 elixir on offense, and they can easily even just sack some damage, and then go on a counter push, and I can't defend. So my biggest tip, number one tip I would say, is don't overcommit too early. Right, later on in the game there are times where you can go that aggressive and get away with it if you need to. Like, for example, if you need to just win the game and if you go all out, that can be the play. But yeah, that would be my number one tip. And kind of jutting off of that, I would say don't overcommit with spells. Like, I think as players get a bit better and you start getting, climbing up the ranks, players tend to spend less elixir and they kind of realize that, okay, I shouldn't be dropping 10 elixir at the bridge. But one massive mistake I still see, even in Royal Champion, even in Ultimate Champion to be honest, is that someone will go for a Miner supporting a support troop, but then they'll also just chuck a poison on top. That's an extra 4 elixir and you're poisoning essentially nothing. And so if the opponent was smart, and what good players tend to do is when players do something like that, you could just ignore the poison, sack some of that Miner damage and just go in. And right, in single elixir, that means now they're down 7 elixir just going Miner poison. And Miner poison won't take your tower. That's just an example. You see it as well with Hog EQ or a bunch of decks. Really, it can happen with any deck where they'll just cycle arrows on top of nothing, just trying to get a prediction or something crazy. Overcommitting with spells, especially in single elixir, is one of the biggest mistakes that I see in players. So that would be my first tip. My second tip is going to be kind of the opposite. Not overcommitting, but in this instance I'm going to be talking about over-defending. Right? It's something that is very, very common, and it comes down to not knowing exactly how much damage a troop does to your tower when left alone, right? So if somebody drops a Miner on my tower, I know roughly it does, in the 600-700 damage range, and that there are instances where it makes sense to leave that alone, right? I know that if I hog at the tower and you leave a hog alone, it takes a hog 7 hits to die from a tower, right? A hog will get 7 hits onto a tower if you just leave it alone. So having a good understanding of how much damage you will take will allow you then to know when you can just ignore some damage and focus on offense, right? Because the point of this game isn't to defend with taking no damage, right? It's just to take their towers whilst protecting yours. That often does mean that sometimes the right play is just ignore a push that they're doing and try and punish them, right? You can go really aggressive in the right lane or the left lane and try and really punish what it is that they're doing. And the only way in which you can do that is if you've understood the way in which cards interact with towers. Now it's gotten a little more difficult with the Cannoneer because now you essentially have to relearn all of that for 2 tower troops and maybe more in the future. So that will just come down to practicing, and it kind of happens subconsciously. As you guys play, you'll probably just realize that, oh, okay, I can't really ignore a balloon on my tower, it will take the whole thing. Whereas I can ignore, you know, a couple skeletons. And right, that sort of back and forth that you have in Clash Royale of attacking and defending, the more efficiently you can defend, right, spending the least amount of elixir possible, will then only just give you more elixir for your offense. And this is a general tip regardless of what deck you play. It's practiced more in heavier decks, right? You'll often see a Golem player just sacking their tower, which isn't really a good play, but, you know, you'll see it very common with heavier decks. But even with cycle decks, it's overlooked, and that's kind of how you know, master cycle decks as well. A big part of it is knowing when to take damage and when you can just punish your opponent. So yeah, that would be my second tip, is learn and try your best not to over defend. My third tip that I'm going to give is kind of a developed skill. It's something that you can practice and get better at, and it's counting card cycle, right? So what exactly does that mean? It really just means keeping track of what cards your opponent has at all times. Now, you get better at it, and of course it's really hard when you first start to keep track of 4 cards, and it becomes a subconscious action later on, like when you get more experience in the game. You kind of notice these patterns in the game, that you'll throw a Hog Rider, they'll defend, then they'll go on the offensive, then you'll defend, and you know, it's this back and forth, and then in between, once both sides have attacked and defended, then there's usually like this waiting period of waiting for elixir, you know, when both of you are at 2 elixir, and it's just nothing's happening for like 8 seconds. You know, this sort of back and forth, it becomes easier, because it becomes almost like a pattern in your brain. But when you're first starting off, in order to do it, you need to first know what all the cards in your opponent's deck is, right? So that obviously is, like I mentioned earlier, the first thing you have to do in a game. Then once you do that, right, you know that it takes 4 cards to get back to a card. So once somebody plays, you know, a Hog Rider, it takes them playing 4 cards before they have a Hog Rider back in their hand. Now, that allows you to know when you can punish and when you can't, right? There are times where knowing exactly what they have in hand will allow you then to know, okay, I know I can't go in, right? So like I said earlier, you have this back and forth of attacking and defending, but sometimes even if you're up tons of elixir, you still can't go in because you know that they have a really good counter in hand, which will give them a massive positive elixir trade and give away your whole advantage. So in that situation, it's obviously just better to just play some cards in the back and like sort of build up the pressure, as opposed to just going all in and using all of your advantage in one go. So keeping track of card cycle is extremely important, and of course it's something that takes time, and I know it's difficult, but I'm telling you, keeping track of card cycle is infinitely more important than keeping track of elixir, right? This is common that people like, you need to know exactly how much elixir your opponent has. You really don't. I mean, if it's good to have a general gist and understanding of what they have, but to know exactly what elixir they have at all times isn't really really necessary. And going along with keeping track of card cycle is keeping track of evolution cycle. That's become so important now that evolutions are in the game, that, for example, when I was a Hog Rider player, whenever they have Evo Skellies in hand, even if I'm up 6 elixir, but I don't have any way of killing those Evo Skeletons, I'm not going to go for a Hog Rider, because they're just going to go Evo Skeletons and it's going to full counter. So that's one instance where really keeping track of card cycle is really important. Just before I hit Ultimate Champion here, I'm going to share with you guys one trick that I do that helps a lot with getting higher up on ladder and pushing in general. It's actually a psychological trick, kind of, that you even see like people using really high up on ladder, and it's kind of called conditioning your opponent, right? So what I mean by this is that there's this pattern in the game where you make your plays, you go on offense, and then you defend, and then you go for the same kind of offense again, then you defend, and that kind of conditions your opponent with how they defended, right? So the first time they defend doing something, like let's say I go for a Hog Rider, and they just go for a cannon, right? Then every time I go for a Hog Rider, they're going to keep going for a cannon, and they're going to go for a cannon. And you can use that to your advantage, right? You can constantly go for Hog Riders. And then eventually you can go for a Hog Rider plus Fireball, for example. And they're not expecting it because you've conditioned them that you're only going to go for a Hog Rider. And it's a subtle trick, but it's one you guys can use quite effectively to push up. As you guys can see, I just pushed to on my second account, Ultimate Champion. Didn't have the best win rate, but it wasn't terrible. I'll make a part 2 to this video at some point, sharing even more tips, but a sub to the channel would be greatly appreciated. Check out my Twitch, and yeah, have a great day, guys. Peace.